You're sitting in a room. In front of you, a panel with 30 buttons. Each button represents an electric shock. 15 volts, 30 volts, 45. The numbers keep climbing. The last button reads 450 volts. Next to it, a red label, danger, severe shock. On the other side of the wall, you hear a man's voice. He's strapped to a chair, electrodes attached to his body, and you're the person who's going to press those buttons. A scientist in a white lab coat stands beside you. He says it's an experiment about memory and learning. Every time the man gets an answer wrong, you must deliver a shock, starting at 15 volts and increasing with each mistake. Would you press the button? Most people say no. When researchers ask hypothetically, almost everyone claims they would stop at the first signs of pain, that they would never torture an innocent human being just because someone told them to. But in 1961, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram decided to test that certainty. And what he discovered destroyed the idea that normal people are incapable of doing monstrous things. The experiment worked like this. Milgram recruited ordinary men through newspaper ads. He offered $4 for participation. When they arrived at the lab, they met another participant. What they didn't know was that this second participant was a hired actor. Both drew slips from a hat to decide who would be the teacher and who would be the learner. The draw was rigged. The real participant always became the teacher. The actor always became the learner. The learner was taken to another room and strapped to a chair with electrodes. The teacher stayed in the main room, facing the shock panel. A scientist in a white lab coat remained at his side, observing. The test began. The learner received a list of words to memorize. The teacher asked questions. With each wrong answer, the teacher had to press the next button. 15 volts, 30 volts, 45. At first, the learner complained mildly, a groan, a protest. But as the shocks increased, the reactions grew more intense. At 75 volts, the learner grunted in pain. At 120 volts, he shouted that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, he begged to be let out, said he didn't want to participate anymore, that his heart was racing. At 200 volts, the screams became agonizing. At 300 volts, he refused to answer, pounded on the wall desperately. At 330 volts, complete silence. No response, no sound, nothing. And the scientist in the white coat? He simply said, "Please continue." If the participant hesitated, the scientist had 4 prepared phrases. The first, "Please continue." The second, "The experiment requires that you continue." The third, "It is absolutely essential that you continue." The fourth, "You have no other choice. You must continue." No threats, no physical coercion, just a man in a white coat saying it was necessary to continue. Before the experiment, Milgram asked 40 psychiatrists what they thought would happen. The prediction was that less than 1% of participants would deliver the maximum shock. Only sadists and psychopaths would go that far. The reality was devastating. 65% of participants delivered the maximum shock of 450 volts. Even while hearing screams, even while hearing pleas, even after the person on the other side stopped responding completely. 2 out of 3 ordinary men, fathers, regular workers, went all the way. None of them were psychopaths. None had a history of violence. They were absolutely normal people, like you, like me. Many participants showed extreme distress. They sweated, they trembled. Some laughed nervously. Others begged the scientist to check if the learner was okay. But when the scientist told them to continue, they obeyed. Why? Milgram identified several factors. The first was the legitimacy of authority. The scientist wore a white coat. He was in a Yale laboratory. He represented science, knowledge, the institution. Questioning that authority felt wrong. The second factor was the transfer of responsibility. The scientist said he would take full responsibility for whatever happened, and that was enough. If the blame wasn't theirs, why stop? The third was gradual commitment. The shocks started small. 15 volts doesn't hurt anyone. Neither does 30. And each new button was just slightly worse than the one before. At what exact point should you stop? The line was never clear. Milgram ran dozens of variations of the experiment and discovered something crucial. When the scientist gave orders by phone instead of being present in the room, obedience dropped to 21%. When the participant had to hold the learner's hand on a shock plate, obedience dropped to 30%. When two other fake teachers refused to continue, 90% of participants also stopped. The physical presence of authority increased obedience. Proximity to the victim decreased it. And seeing others disobey gave permission to disobey. In 1961, the same year as the experiment, Adolf Eichmann was being tried in Jerusalem. He was the Nazi responsible for the logistics of the Holocaust. He organized the transport of millions of Jews to extermination camps. Philosopher Hannah Arendt attended the trial, and she was disturbed. She expected to find a monster. What she found was an ordinary bureaucrat, a mediocre man who said he was just following orders. She called this the banality of evil. The idea that ordinary people can participate in absolute horrors simply through obedience to authority. Milgram proved it in a laboratory. Now, how do you protect yourself from this? There are 3 warning signs that indicate when you're being manipulated by an authority figure. First, if someone says you have no choice, that phrase is a lie. You always have a choice. When someone verbally removes your options, they're trying to shut down your moral judgment. Second, if someone says they'll take responsibility for the consequences, that's impossible. Moral responsibility cannot be transferred. If your hands perform the action, the responsibility is yours. Third, if you notice you're doing something gradually worse than you would normally do, stop and ask yourself, would I do this if no one had ordered me to? If the answer is no, you've already crossed a line. The only real defense against destructive obedience is knowing this tendency exists, knowing it exists inside you. Because when the situation arises, and it will, you need to remember that uniforms, titles, and lab coats don't turn a wrong order into a right one. 65% went all the way because they didn't know this was possible. Now, you know.